Welcome to IT Audit Webinar Training via Practical Application, presented jointly by AuditNet and Richard Cascarino and Associates. This webinar is part of the Training Without Travel series covering IT audit. Today's session will be covering securing the Internet. My name is Jim Kaplan. I'm founder and owner of AuditNet, and I will be moderating today's webinar. Joining us is Richard Cascarino, principal of Richard Cascarino and Associates, who will cover Securing the Internet, part of our Advanced IT Audit series. Let me have Richard introduce himself, give you a brief overview of his background, and then I'll cover the housekeeping items for this webinar, and then we'll get right into the meat and potatoes of the topic. Richard?
Thanks, Jim. As Jim said, my name is Richard Cascarino. I'm the principal of Richard Cascarino and Associates, based out of Steamboat Springs in Colorado and Johannesburg in South Africa. My background is primarily in IT and IT audit, both from the consulting side as well as from the audit training side. I'm a past president of the IIA in South Africa, a member of ISACA, a member of the ACFE, and the author of 3 books that you'll see on the screen there, plus one that I'm currently writing at the moment. As far as the housekeeping is concerned, I'll hand you back to Jim and he'll take you through that.
Thanks, Richard. Well, we sent out the slides this morning that have the housekeeping information, so I'm not going to read the information. However, I will just remind you that we are recording today's webinar and you will be receiving access to that recording. Tomorrow afternoon, we'll be sending out the follow-up email. We also will, there will be an evaluation that will appear at the end of the webinar. You can help us continuously improve our webinars by answering the survey, taking the survey and answering those questions. We are operating under NASBA rules today, so you must answer all of the polling questions. These are not the survey questions that we send out after the event, but the polling questions that will appear during the event. You must answer all of the polling questions to qualify for NASBA CPE, and we will be sending out those certificates by tomorrow, and we'll send them out for both sessions, for Tuesday's session as well as today's session. You can submit questions via the chat box on your screen. We'll answer them usually at the time that we break for polling questions. The next slide provides you disclaimer information. Again, that was sent out in this morning's slides, so I'm not going to read that. Please pay attention to that slide in your handouts. And at this point, I would like to turn the floor back to Richard to get into today's topic of securing the Internet. Richard?
Thanks, Jim. Okay, welcome. And for those who are here for the full series, welcome back. Today's agenda, as Jim said, we're going to be looking at the Internet. We have this strange conception with the Internet that's a fairly recent thing. In actual fact, it goes back a long, long way. So we'll take a look at what is the Internet. Briefly, we'll have a look at the Internet threats and some of the protection strategies. We'll have a look at Internet security and privacy and the use of digital certificates. And then we look at the client-side security and then combined with the downloading threats. Now, again, there is a conception that if you have a firewall and you use encryption, that's it. You've got absolute security on the Internet. Unfortunately, it's not quite as easy as that. If you are going to use a firewall, you've got to get it right. If you are going to use encryption, then, once again, it depends on how you implement it, where you implement it, and whether everyone is complying with it. And we'll finish up by looking at formulating an Internet security plan overall. Okay, so what is the Internet and where did it start? Well, it goes back. It goes back to about 1976. In fact, there were precedents before that when ARPA was set up, but we can really trace it back to about 76 when UUCP was developed, and in 79 Usenet was set up. Now, we didn't call it the internet at that time. It didn't really have a name at all. But when 1982 came along, ARPA set up TCP and IP, the Internet Protocol. And by 1983, we saw the Internet Activities Board being established. Now, the problem at that point was still that if you wished to communicate, you had to know exactly who you were trying to communicate to and how you were going to go about it. So it was a problem. And that was solved when they came up with the concept of the domain name server, where the idea was you didn't need to know the exact location, you needed to know a name for the location, and it would look up what the network address of that location was. In 1984, we saw the 1,000 host barrier broken. By 1987, things had moved on. We'd hit 10,000 hosts on the internet, and user-to-user net was founded. Along came Internet Relay Chat, and that came about in about 1988. And by 1989, we saw the 100,000 host barrier. 1990, ARPA, which had become ARPANET, ceased to exist altogether. But there was a demand had developed for having some kind of security with all this communication flying around. And 1991 saw the advent of a package called Pretty Good Privacy. And that was released onto the internet, and all hell was let loose, because it was an encrypting mechanism which allowed dual key encryption. One key would encrypt and a different key decrypted. So you had a private key and a public key. The public key you put out into the public domain. If you want to talk to me, encrypt everything with this key. The only one who knows the private key is me, so I'm the only one who can decrypt it. By 1991, we were seeing 1 trillion bytes of information flowing a month and 10 billion packets a month. And in 1992, the Internet Society was chartered with, and we hit the 1 million host level. Now, still at that time, we were running the Internet. We still didn't have the World Wide Web. The World Wide Web really came in between 1992 and 1993. Prior to that, we had things like Telnet and various other communication protocols. But with the advent of HTTP, we saw the World Wide Web come in, and it started growing exponentially. And it grew in 1993 at 341,000%, which is quite a good growth rate. By 1994, we saw shopping centers trading on the internet. 1995, search engines became Time Magazine's Technology of the Year. 1996, the Internet World Exposition was founded. And 1997, Bill Gates nominated 1997 the year of the Internet. I'm not going to go through all of the years from 1997 till now, you'll be glad to know. But we tend to think that the Internet, number one, has been around forever, and number two, only started about 10, 15 years ago. 1997 was nearly 20 years ago. Now, what have we got? We've got social networks. We've got WikiLeaks. We've got all kinds of mobile computing using the internet as a backbone for our communications. So if that's what the internet is, what do we use it for? Well, these days, still 70% of internet users are either email users or social network users. And the internet basically is used for quick, reasonably priced communication accessible worldwide. Okay. We still see a fairly high proportion of text-based exchanges, either via emails or through file attachments, etc., or through FTP itself, File Transfer Protocol. And it's used essentially as a way of exchanging information. But coming with that is the whole idea of graphical exchanges, which are much more user-friendly and much more business-friendly. And unfortunately, much riskier. Because when we get graphical interchanges, then you become exposed on the internet. And I use exposed in its widest possible sense. So what are the risks? Well, out there in the internet is them. Here we have us, out there is them. And we worry about them. We worry about unauthorized access to our information. Now, it could be exchanges of information. If I send a message to you on the internet, basically I'm broadcasting it to the world. So if I don't take the appropriate precautions to lock that up, anyone and his grandmother can read my communication with you and read your reply to me. They may be able to copy it, they may be able to modify it, and they may be able to send out the modified version. We're also a target for information collectors and seekers. Now, personally, I am an information collector and seeker. I do a lot of research on the internet on what the current situation is and what people are currently doing from a security perspective, as well as from a hacking perspective. But in addition to people who are genuinely using all of that information for research, you have the people who are using that information for somewhat more illicit purposes. There's always been an ability to find out things about people or about companies. It's part of what auditors do when we do due diligence. If you're thinking about taking over a company, you want all of the information you can get about that company. But these days, there's also a subculture where I can go to an information broker and get them to find out everything that is available on the internet about you or about your organization, including some of the stuff that you thought was confidential or private. And I can do it for a fee, or I can do it just for the hell of it. We're also then seeing selective release of information, the WikiLeaks of this world, where confidential information is then being leaked onto the internet. And it dates back many years, some must be 20, 25 years ago now. A gentleman who was a student in London studying computer science got a job for the Christmas vacation at the post office, and he was delivering Christmas cards and helping around the post office. But because he had joined the post office, they automatically gave him access to the computer systems. And having got access to the computer systems, he then said, well, I'm going to be a computer major. I wonder what I can find. So he went browsing around, and he discovered all of the internal telephone numbers for Buckingham Palace, for the Queen's residence. And he discovered all of the internal telephone numbers for GCHQ in Cheltenham. Now, GCHQ in Cheltenham is the equivalent of Langley for the CIA. This is the British spy network. And he took all of that and published it on the internet, including the names of all of Britain's top spies and their telephone numbers, including the direct telephone lines into the Queen. And when it hit the web, all hell was let loose. And all of these telephone numbers had to be changed, and all of the security had to be tightened up, and nobody could get in and do it again, except for the fact that 2 weeks later, a reporter from the Glasgow Herald newspaper went undercover, applied for a job with the post office, and within a day had obtained all of the same information with all of the new telephone numbers. So selective release of information through unauthorized access is a huge risk for most organizations. But it's not just releasing information. Through the internet, if it's not properly guarded, you can get unauthorized access into the internal networks of any organization. Either remote application access or potentially the ability to control the systems, the networks, and the subsystems. So how does it happen? Well, there's a variety of ways, including false identities, coming in via a fictitious interface, pretending to be someone known to the network, but not you. And they can use that either for rumor stimulation or opinion gravitation. Opinion gravitation, I can start a campaign on the internet to say how wonderful this brand new film is. I know it's coming up for the Oscars. I can start a campaign on there and set it up fraudulently. Now, in the UK, they recently had an election, and the opinion polls got it somewhat wrong. They had the two main parties running neck and neck, where in actual fact one of them gained nearly 40% and the other one only got 20%. Why did they get it so far wrong? Well, a lot of the information they were gathering using online interrogation. So they were doing their surveys online. And if you plant the information appropriately, you can gravitate opinion whichever way you want, either for something or against it. Rumor stimulation. Many years ago, before the internet, I received a hoax fax which told me how Rank Xerox was a really nasty company because they had used Jewish slave labor in the concentration camps in Germany during World War II to build photocopiers. And that became effectively a circular letter, and everyone was passing it on to everyone else, and it was a total hoax to blacken the name of Rank Xerox. And Rank Xerox had to go to court and be able to prove that they were never in the concentration camps. They did not make photocopiers of that nature at that time, so they couldn't have done it. But you can't sue anyone because you don't know who you're suing. Now that was bad enough, but about five years ago, I received an email saying this has just come to light that Rank Xerox during World War II was using Jewish slave labor, blah, blah, blah. Please pass this on. So the ability to create a rumor onto social media and have social media spread it as if it was gospel is colossal. The thing we have to remember whenever you look at anything on the internet is that 50 to 60% is going to be good, solid information. At least 10% is absolute rubbish. And another 10% is wrong, just plain wrong. So all of those are risks through fictitious interfaces. Communication disruption, because we have become so dependent on our emails, our social media, our Twitters, of this world, you're sitting open to disruptions of those communications, either through blowouts or spoofing of emails. Spoofing of an email is simply sending you an email from your boss saying you're fired, but coming actually from me. So when you walk into your boss's office and empty the trash can over his head, guess what? You now are fired. And that's spoofing. Tripping protection limits and going into denial of service attacks, or simply slowing down the business. Now that's bad enough, but then it's not a problem because we've got firewalls and we've got routers and we can circumvent all of these risks. Problem is they don't always work as intended. We also have compliance issues with all of the legislation that's around. Privacy issues. If private information is leaked via your organization's computer systems or computer networks, then turning around and saying, but it wasn't us that leaked it, doesn't help. You've blown the privacy legislation. And the problem then is, whose responsibility is it? Is it the employee who allowed it to happen? Is it management? You've got all kinds of business-to-business issues where if your machine goes down, or your machine is corrupt, or your machine is sending out spoof messages, there could be consequential liability and breach of contract issues when you're dealing with your own business partners. We also run into another problem, which is the whole concept of net law. It's bad enough in America, where if we are doing interstate transactions, which states' laws apply? So if I am in Colorado and I buy cigarettes via the internet to be sent to me from New York, what tax rate do I pay? Is it the New York tax rate or is it the Colorado tax rate? Because the price of cigarettes in those two states is colossally different. Now that's bad enough. But if I now go overseas and order the cigarettes to come from South Africa, South Africa's tax is much lower than American tax on things like alcohol, cigarettes, etc. So now do I have to pay import duty? Do I have to pay the tax at the South African end or pay the tax at the American end? And is the law enforceable? And that includes everything that's going on within that machine. It includes all of your server's contents, all of the monitoring of user activities. Copyright on the internet can be a problem depending on which country you're operating from. Defamation can be very difficult to prove and very difficult to prosecute, depending on the laws of the country from which the defamation originated. There was a survey done in 2010 by CERT, and they came to the conclusion that cyber crimes are rocketing, and they are increasing far faster than many organizations can handle. They're just not in a position to combat them. Our current security models are only minimally effective against cyber crime. And we're finding more and more repeat offence where someone breaks in, is noted, is reported, is picked up, nothing is done about it, and they come straight back in the same back door and do the same thing. Part of the reason, according to CERT, is that many cybercrimes go unreported. Either the company is embarrassed, or the company doesn't know who to report it to, or the company simply doesn't want to know because they don't see it as a significant business problem. I'm still dealing with boards of directors who do not see IT as a major problem in their industry, despite the fact that in some of them the computer is their industry nowadays. Financial institutions process data. That's the business they're in. They think of themselves as bankers, and they think of themselves as investment bankers or whatever. But at the end of the day, their investments are worth whatever the computer says they're worth. And it's difficult to get that message across to senior executives. So what should we be doing about it? Well, these are some of the leading preventative practices to stop these things happening. Conduct periodic penetration tests of your systems. That's one way to do it. And there are various software packages that you can use that will actually allow you to test your systems. Implement periodic security education and awareness programs for your employees so that they know what can happen and what their role is in preventing it happening and what to do if they see it happening. And sending out regular communication about security from senior management. So, what are the major threats that we face right now? Right now, we're looking at insiders and external, outsiders. The problem is that we are coming out of a recessional period, and in a recessional period, a lot of insiders become ex-insiders. So they are now outsiders, and they're outsiders with a grudge against the organization. They know your systems, they know your clerical controls, they know how to access the systems, and sometimes they know the back doors into the systems. We're seeing social engineering going wild. We're seeing the advent of mobile devices. Mobile devices are everywhere now. And we're not talking just about notebook computers, we're talking about cell phones, smartphones. Smartphones with everything built into them, including user IDs and passwords, to allow the owner of the cell phone access into corporate environment and corporate computers via the internet. And cell phones are one of the most commonly stolen devices, with all of the passwords, etc., on them. Poor destruction of confidential information. Some years ago, I was running an ACL course, and it was a hands-on one in an area in Africa where the users had no access to any computers. So I had to take some with me. So I didn't want to buy a whole pile of computers that were then going to sit doing nothing. So I went out and bought some second-hand kit. And this was computers that I bought through a second-hand computer dealer, and all of the hard disks were scrubbed before I got them. However, since I didn't trust the dealer that well, I thought, I'm not taking a chance that there's still a virus on there, I'm going to wipe out the whole hard disk again. So I wiped it out on 5 of them. When it came to the 6th one, the hard disk was only half the size it was supposed to be. So I thought, that's strange, I've been diddled. So I opened up the box and looked, and no, it was the right size hard disk. I thought, aha, they've formatted it as a C drive and a D drive. That's what it is. So having done a virus check on the C drive and there was nothing on it, I then went into the D drive. And on the D drive was a whole pile of insurance records. This was a second-hand computer from an insurance company. And all of the client records were still sitting on this hard disk. Now, where we're dealing with notebook computers, we have to worry about what's on that hard disk. We may have protection on our mainframes, etc., but when it comes down onto the local hard disk on a notebook, how then do you protect it? Are you encrypting that? Because if something goes wrong, if your machine breaks down, what's the first thing you do? You take it to the engineers. and say, can you fix this? And you have no idea what they're going to see or do or use from your computer. It can work in the law enforcement's favour as well. Many years ago, not many years ago, a few years ago, there was a singer who had been very popular in the UK in the 60s and 70s, a guy called Gary Glitter. And his career had taken a nosedive over the years, and he wanted to have a new tour to bring him back to full publicity. So he was writing some new songs, and he ran out of disk space, and he took his computer in and asked them to convert everything on the hard disk onto a bigger hard disk for him. And when they did, they found a whole pile of child pornography on there, and Gary Glitter went to jail, and that was the end of his career. So, from both aspects, confidential information needs to be taken care of. Now, the alternative when we start getting into the internet is instead of using your notebook computer, you're going to use your tablet, and you're not going to hold your information on your computer locally. You're going to hold it out there in the cloud, which is great. You can now access it from anywhere in the world on any computer. Terrific. And so can anyone else if they can pretend to be you. So as soon as you move into cloud computing, your major threat is loss of user identity and poor authentication of users, not knowing who is at the other end of that keyboard. We also have a major problem with inadequate security event monitoring. If we don't monitor, then nobody's going to notice, and if nobody notices, nobody's going to fix it. We still have the standard problems of poor access control, with users having far too much power into our systems, but now they can sign in from anywhere in the world. Inadequate authentication. We are still relying so heavily on the use of passwords, and passwords have always been one of the poorest secure authentication mechanisms that you can have. Nowadays, of course, you don't even need to get access to the data lines because we're using wireless access. Now that's where we are. Problem is, where are we going? Well, we're seeing browser-based attacks via our wireless networking. We're seeing cross-site scripting attacks. If you go into a website, whose website are you on, the Obama one or the Clinton one? If I log into a bank, am I logging into my bank or am I logging into your bank by mistake? Microsoft in 2007 removed 300% more Trojan horse downloader programs, in other words malware, from Windows machines in the last 6 months of 2007 compared to the first 6 months. 1 in every 123 inspected machines per month was infected with Trojan. So it's a nasty one. Where else? Well, we're all familiar, I hope, with phishing. It's a kind of thing that says, dear sir, your LinkedIn site has now been suspended because we believe someone was trying to break into your computer via LinkedIn. Please enter your user ID and password and then change it to a new password immediately so that I can record it and then I'll have access to your information. Because if you're using that password on LinkedIn, it's probably the same one that you're using all over your computer. But it's now moved away from sending you an email into social networks. And we're starting to see phishing coming in via tweets and via all kinds of standard software packages. We're also seeing bogus security software. So you get a message that says there is a virus going around. You need to be aware of it. Here is a new issue from Windows, and it's a screen that looks like a Microsoft Windows screen. Download this to fix it. We're also seeing bounce back backscatter. Bounce back backscatter accounts for some 2 to 3% of all spam. And the way it works is someone will send me a message and it will pick up the backscatter from my machine to then relay to everyone that I know. Botnets. Botnets creating zombie computers. Botnets have been picked up on networks of up to 500,000 machines, all running the same botnet. The idea behind the botnet is if I want to attack your system, I could set my computer up to start attacking yours, and it's going to take a couple of years. So why don't I just take that little piece of coding and stick it onto every computer that I can get access to and every computer that they can get access to, and let all of these act as zombies on my behalf, attacking your computer. I have a question coming in. Okay, Jim. Sorry. Jim is reminding me about the polling questions. It's not a problem. We will get to the polling questions. Rootkits, capable of taking control of the system without authorization of the system users. And that will take us to our first polling question. The first polling question is looking at internet compliance issues, and that could include monitoring user activities, privacy issues, rumor stimulation, business slowdown. Which would be a compliance issue for the internet? Remember, you don't have to get it right, but you do have to answer it if you want your CPE. So which would be a compliance issue as far as the internet is concerned? And we'll close the poll and share the results. And the majority of people have gone with privacy issues, which would be correct. Okay, now to a certain extent, unauthorized monitoring of user activities could be classed as a privacy issue. Authorized monitoring would not be. But where it is a privacy issue, that's definitely a compliance issue that you've got. So, where else do we worry? Well, big advent these days is on mobile agents. Mobile code acting autonomously on behalf of a user to do continuous collecting and processing of information. And again, that mobile agent can be created by, for example, myself, and go out and visit a whole number of hosts before coming back to me. And it comes out in the form of different ways of doing it. Web applets. Okay, now most of our computers are set to allow web applets to run. so that you get the little Microsoft flag waving, or you get the world going round. But these are each actually programs which you have given permission to come down onto your computer and do whatever they want to do. And part of that could well be identity theft. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying get rid of the internet. The internet is a business reality and it makes business sense. If you're not using the internet, if you don't have an internet presence, then you are running back in the 18th century. But we need to stop that reality becoming a nightmare, which means that from an audit perspective and from a consultancy perspective, any new business connectivity needs to be reviewed. What are we connecting to? Who is connecting to what are we connecting to? It's as they used to say with the advent of HIV/AIDS, when they were promoting the use of condoms. When you sleep with a person, you're sleeping with every person that person has ever slept with. And it's the same thing with connectivity. When you connect to a computer, you're connecting to everyone currently connected and who has ever connected to that computer. So our internal safeguards have to become a first priority. And the way that should be happening is our network policies can set the tone. But then we need to build external safeguards to match those policies. Saying you shouldn't do these things isn't enough. You stop, think, and then connect. And I've gone into organizations where retail organizations, where they'll turn around and say, well, we don't take credit cards anymore, we only take electronic transfers. There's a terminal over there. You can log into your bank and transfer the money to us. And people go and do it without any thought as to what kind of monitoring software could be running on that computer. And people will use their mobile devices. They'll be using all kinds of social media without any thought of what could be monitoring what's happening on that social media. And remember, there are insider threats as well as external threats. If I'm sitting in the office and I'm using any kind of mobile device, anyone in the office could be monitoring what I'm doing. So am I encrypting or am I not? Threats from within, threats to raw data. The raw data that's being held, whether it's being held out on the web or whether it's being held locally and the threats coming in via the web. Threats to the communication systems themselves, denial of service, spoofing, impersonation, additional transactions, loss of transactions, all of the access vulnerabilities, identity theft, business continuity, fraud. These have not gone away because we've gone on to the internet. They were there as a threat, they're still there as a threat. Lack of customer retention, failure of your business success. And these days, of course, we have to worry about sexual harassment or stalking performed using your computer. Now, that's not to say you're doing it, but if someone is doing sexual harassment via your computer and that gets detected, then you may have the problem that you're going to be accused, and you may or may not be able to prove that it wasn't you. Other threats: cyber smut, cyber harassment and cyberbullying. These are all ongoing threats. Now, in the corporate environment, we have security people who are supposed to help us with these things. In the home environment, it's not so easy. Breaking and entry, investment and other scams, online gambling. And the nice thing about the internet or not nice, depending on which way your view is that you can do online gambling even in countries where gambling is illegal. So you can break the law via the computer. Theft of trade secrets, money laundering, extortion, all possible. They've always been there, but now we've made them so much easier using the technology. We still use Ethernet communication as a basis, okay, in many organizations. A lot of financial institutions will not allow you to use wireless networks within the office. Everything has to be done via Ethernet. Problem, it was never secure from eavesdropping. There were over 1 million eavesdrop attempts were captured in 1994. Sniffing tools are common. They're commonly available. You can download them on the internet and run them. And as long as you are plugged into the same Ethernet connection as someone else on the network, you can monitor anything that's going on. If you're not sure, just go into any hacker connection and you'll find them there that you can download. Credit card numbers are a piece of cake. And they've come crashing down in price because they're so easy and cheap to hack. As I say, over 1 million credit cards were captured in 1994. And it doesn't matter how good your password is if I can capture it. But standardly delivered passwords are still in wide use. Many of our routers come with a Unix-based system because if you're running Linux on it, it's cheaper than running Windows on a router. And Linux, being Unix-based, comes with its primary user ID as root and the initial password as root. And over and over and over again, we don't change them. Net effect is someone coming in. You may have your own encryption, but if I try signing in to your router, if I can get a web address for your router, and if I know the manufacturer, I can look it up on their website, look into the user manual, and it will tell me what the address is for the router. And if I try a user ID of root with a password of root, in 60% of the cases I'm going to get straight into your router. And now I can switch off your encryption, or I can change your password. I can do anything I want. Who do we worry about doing all these things? Well, we've got our current employees, our disaffected employees, someone who didn't get the promotion they thought they should have got, or didn't get the pay rise they thought they were entitled to. People like me, consultants, temporary staff, those who are, as they say, reality challenged. The amateurs, the hackers, the crackers, etc., are the radicals. Now, the radicals could be ISIS, or it could be environmental campaigners, it could be animal rights campaigners, etc. And these days, as I said, you can actually get cyber criminals for hire. So we worry about all of them. Why have we come up with this problem? Because in many cases, whoops, I pressed the wrong button. In many cases, we have a Maginot Line mentality. Now, this has come about as a throwback or a throw forward from the days of mainframe computers. For those of you who are not familiar with history, the Maginot Line was a defense line that was strung across Belgium and France after the First World War. And the idea was that with the Maginot Line there, Germany could no longer invade, and that was wonderful. Except for the fact Germany did not try and invade the Maginot Line. They went round it. because it did not go completely from end to end. And we've got the same thing with a lot of our mainframes that says we will defend at the outline. You cannot get into our mainframe because you need a user ID and password and you will not have one. Of course, if you do have one, then you must be a registered user and on you go and do anything you want. Then we saw the rise and proliferation of wireless networks, mobile technology, and integration of all of these components. And we were still running with a Maginot Line mentality. It says, keep them out on the boundary. Don't worry about them once they're inside. I'm afraid you have to worry about them when they're inside. And that means that many of our users, particularly the users using social networks, are now responsible for security. Now, they've never been trained in security. They've never been shown how to implement security. But nevertheless, they are required to implement it, because if they don't, anyone connected to them potentially is connected to you. We're using limited security technology. Most users use antivirus, some use anti-malware, and a few use firewalls. But how good are your firewalls? They're as good as they have been set up to be. And unfortunately, most firewalls and most security technology were designed to be used by IT security professionals, which means that when you look at how do I do this, you need to be an IT fundi, a guru, in order to make sense of how do I set this thing up, and to make sense of the messages you get if something's wrong. So most people will either go for, oh, I want security, switch it on. Oh, that's a pain, switch it off. And they end up with nothing. Impacts can be anything from destruction, denial of service attacks, disclosure of your confidential information, damage or modification of data, fraud on a massive scale. Now, if you're lucky, it's just going to be an annoyance. You're going to find that when you try to do things, it doesn't move as fast as it should, it doesn't work quite the way it should, and it's just a pain. But if it's malicious, you've got real problems. Common cause, user awareness. Back in 2008, hospitals reported that 64% of respondents cited controlling user access to clinical systems as the top IT security concern. That was from a Korean study back in February 2008. User access to clinical systems. Not hackers. This was their internal users. So if they're not worried about it with that, why should anyone else be worried about it? The standard that I usually ask people in the class is, how often do you change your password? And everyone says, oh yes, we change it once every 30 days. Why? Because the computer forces us to. Okay. When was the last time you changed your PIN number for your ATM? Because that's your money. And if you're not prepared to protect your money, actual hard cash, why should anyone believe that your social media is any better protected? We also find conflicts between management's requirement to get everyone in, bring your own device, let's all get connected together through our intranet, and security gets in the way, so let's drop that. We're looking at a reactive investment where people see technology as a whole solution. It's not. Technology is a tool. It can only be as effective as the people using it allow it to be. So how do we work with this internet stuff? How do I determine who's actually talking to me at any given point in time? We all know our internet addresses. It's a 12-digit 32-bit number, what's known as a dotted octet. It's an octet because in binary you can count from 0 to 7 in 3 bits. So that's an octet. Now, the internet address is unique for every machine across the network, and since the internet is worldwide, that means it's unique for everyone in the world. And you get the addresses from the Network Information Center, NIC. They assign the addresses. First 3 digits is your network number. The last 3 digits are the host on the network. And all of the other ones represent the subnets. And each 3 can count from 0 to 254. Okay? Remember, you're dealing with bits, binary digits. So any one of these binary digits can count up from 0 to 254. Reasons 254 is 255 is reserved. So if you are looking at someone on the internet, if someone is communicating with you, how do you interpret that domain name? Well, first and foremost, we read it as if it was Arabic. You read from right to left, not left to right. So user ID @domain.name. Outside of the States, the last 2 digits are the country code. So .co.za, South Africa, uses 2 digits instead of .com is .za. And there are 3 basic parts to the whole concept of the domain name server. Resolver software, which resolves any inquiries on domain names and host names, and the DNS data file, which contains its own files and is accessed via a daemon. A daemon is a software product that serves the zone files for that particular name server. Why is it important? It's important because if I know what your address is, I can become you. Remember, your address is unique to you. So if I can determine that you are not online, potentially I can become you. And the way I find out if you're online or not is to use a command that's been around for a long, long time, and that's ping. All I have to do is ping that address and see if you're online. And if it says you're not online, then I can assume that address and become you, within certain limitations. So your email is not intrinsically secure, nor is your tweet, nor is any of the other social medias. You have to assume that anyone can at minimum read what you're sending. It's coming in through an intermediate processor. I'm using emails as an example because a lot of business work is still done using email. An incoming email can be replied to using remail. So you can use your favorite word processor and paste the text into the email and then forward it on to someone else. It's not a guarantee. Even if you're encrypting email, when it arrives at your environment, it goes on to your mail server and sits there unencrypted unless you have deliberately encrypted that mail server. So internally, your emails are going to be unencrypted. And that brings us to our second polling question. Our second polling question is looking at common causes of internet risk. And common causes of internet risk include management conflict between accuracy and user-friendliness, between security and user-friendliness, disclosure of confidential information, integration, or the use of consultants. Now remember, we're not looking for what is the risk, we're looking for what is the cause of the risk. And we're fully voted. So I'll close the poll and share the results. And we have a split between management conflict between security and availability and user friendliness versus disclosure of confidential information. Remember, disclosure of confidential information is the risk. The cause of that risk is what we're looking for. Or it is a risk. The cause could well be management conflict between security and user friendliness. Other risk areas, other potential risk areas we can look on. Hang on 1 second. I will hide those results so we can go back to the main slides. Other risk areas, potential risk areas, entry to our corporate systems via the internet. Our systems are connected to the internet. Someone coming in via the internet can potentially get into your live corporate systems and do whatever they want. Loss of confidentiality of messages. Use of unattended terminals. Virus spreads. Or simply authentication problems with our messages. So we don't know for a fact where this is coming from. We've got authorization verification, user authentication. And with the internet in the corporate environment, time wasting on a grand scale. You can also end up with phone bills of astronomical proportions when the kids are using the social network. So how do we secure? At the physical link layer, that's the primary access to the transmission medium. At that level, we may encrypt data. I'm working on the assumption that everyone is familiar with encryption, not necessarily the individual encryption methodologies, but at least what it is. But we can also define the perimeters. Any dial-up access into an internet service provider. Use CP or email gateways. In many systems, those still exist. We don't use them. We don't use dial-up in 99.9% of the cases, but it's still there in the software. And because we don't use it, commonly, we don't guard it. It's not spelled out in our firewall, in our email gateways. Use of demilitarized zones, DMZs, and having our own network node on the internet. At the IP layer, you can do network snooping. Network snooping using commercial sniffers, things like Expert Sniffer, EtherFind, or we can place the network interface into what's called promiscuous mode and then run a sniffer. Now with a sniffer, I can say, take, for example, anything going to that network address or coming from that network address and duplicate it to me. So I can sniff and see anything, user IDs, passwords, credit card numbers, whatever. As far as message replay is concerned, I can snoop and record and then replay that message back over and over again. Or I can snoop, record, alter, and replay it back. An interesting question. Is it possible to turn the beeping off in the background? The beeping should now be off in the background. The reason that we had it was we just had what in South Africa is known as load shedding. Load shedding says They don't have enough electricity, so we switch off all the electricity. As a result of which my UPS started beeping at me, and now my standby generators cut in, so I'm back in business. I apologize for the beeping. Okay, if you ever hear that again, you'll know what it is. Okay, at the moment we're getting this. It's now 6 o'clock. Now that it's cut off, it will probably be off until 10 o'clock tonight. And we're getting this 2 to 3 days a week. And they reckon it will go on for another 2 years. Welcome to South Africa. Why? Sorry, not why South Africa. Why the security at the IP layer? Message denial and delay. And we can do that using an intermediate router code to switch things from A to B. We've also got problems with our authentication. Authentication issues because we're using standard protocols, Internet Protocol, TCP/IP. It's been around for a long time. We're still using it today. And we authenticate who we're speaking to using that IP address. So I can either masquerade, I can change the address to another address on that network, and then identify the desired network computer address. Make sure it's offline, I can ping it, and then change the address to its address. Spoofing I mentioned earlier is where I can send an email to your boss from you via your machine, or at least it would appear that. And it uses a weakness in TCP handshaking to permit the presence of being, or the pretense rather, of being a genuine communicating party. So what happens is A sends a request to synchronize to B. It sends a synchronize, a SYN request, including an initial sequence number, an IN. B then replies with its synchronization request and initial security number, sequence number, and acknowledges A's request, sends an ACK. A then acknowledges B's communication, and now the two are talking to each other. Okay, so A says to B, I want to talk to you. B says, okay, I got your message, I want to talk to you too. A then says, okay, I got your message, now we can talk. Now I can interrupt within that, record that information, and play it back so that A thinks that I'm B. And now it thinks it's talking to B, but in actual fact it's talking to me. At the TCP layer, that was at the IP layer. At the TCP layer, you can use illicit privileges to tap into the system software in order to borrow, steal, etc., an open connection. And that's typically used after the user has authenticated to the remote system. So the user signs on as root, gets hijacked, and they change the root password, and now they are the super user. At the application layer, these are the various security layers within the internet. At the application layer, we use a standard authentication, user ID, password, whatever it happens to be. Why? Because we want to be sure. When we turn around and say, halt, who goes there? Are you sure that you know who goes where? Access control. Once I know who you are, once I know for certain who you are, do we stop you and say there are certain areas you can go, or do we still use the Maginot line and say once you're identified, go where you like, do what you want? Integrity of information at the application layer. If it's 5, will it stay 5, or will someone change it to 4 or to 9? And from a confidentiality perspective, who can see it? Now, all of that is telling you here are problems, here are problems, here are problems. Question, what can we do about it? Well, the first thing we have to do is establish where your risk areas are. What are you using the internet for? How are you using it? Are you using it using social media? Are you using it using mobile devices? And once you use those, what are you using it to do? Only when you've figured out what your risk areas are can you define an appropriate security architecture. Now, part of it is going to be using your firewalls. Part of it could be using network address translation. In other words, when you go out onto the internet, your address doesn't go out there. You go through an address translator, and basically it sends out a standard address for all users from this organization, and it's normally part of the firewall. When they go out, it translates it into one standard address. Any information coming back in will come into that standard address, and then the address translator will translate it back to who does this reply go to. We can harden the operating system. If you're not going to use something like Telnet, switch it off. It's there, but you don't need it. Switch it off. Because if you don't switch it off, sooner or later someone's going to try and come in via it. Packet level screening, so that you know what is in each packet of information, where it's going. And for goodness sake, use encryption, the appropriate levels of encryption. In other words, what we're trying to do is establish our risk areas and then harden it to look after the infrastructure. And that should cut out the accidental or the intentional to a certain extent. But preventative controls are never 100% effective, so we need to monitor usage to find out who's trying to come in, who's actually coming in, and how are they coming in, how can we block it. To establish our risk areas, we need to do a proper threat analysis. And that means you need to recognize your valid authorized users are threat sources. Valid users, but unauthorized to do certain things, are also a threat source. And of course, you've got your invalid users. The outsiders, the hackers, the unauthorized users coming in. So you can have an authorized user who's authorized to do certain things and abuses that authority. That's a valid authorized user. A valid unauthorized one is the guy who sits next to me who's authorized to do certain things, but not the things I do. And then the others. We also have our internal threats. We still have corruption, denial of service, leakage of information. If you want to find out how to break into a system, ask someone. Now, if you walk up to a user and say, I'm trying to break into your system, how can I do that? They're not going to tell you. Well, they might. Depends if you make it worth their while. The most likely is that you're going to walk up and say, I'm doing a security survey in your area. Can you tell me what your user ID is, what your password is, when did you last change it? And if you sound appropriate and you look professional, they'll tell you. We've got the external threats, the spoofers of this world, the hackers of this world. And it's not just humans. It's also computers hacking computers, using viruses, using malware, etc. As I said, we don't need to worry because we've got firewalls. This is a quotation from the Computer Security Institute. Of all successful break-ins via the internet, 30% of the targeted companies had a firewall. Now, key words there, of all successful break-ins via the internet, 30% had a firewall. And firewalls can cost anything between nothing and an absurd amount of money. I was asked to do a penetration study on one client. They had a firewall. It was a commercial firewall. They'd paid $1.5 million to have consultants come in, put it in, get it up, get it running, do it properly. And they asked me to do a penetration test to see if I could break in. And it took me half an hour. Because I didn't try and break in from the inside. I went out of the building, used my own computer to log into the internet, external to the building, put in the name of the firewall and said vulnerabilities and Googled it. And up came a whole pile of hacker websites saying, if you've come across this firewall, try this, because they often forget to shut that one down. I came back in with half a dozen options, logged in, and I was able to crack in 3 times within half an hour. Firewalls should be able to, now this doesn't mean they will, they should be able to deny all services except those specifically permitted. Okay. In other words, if it's not told that you're in, you're out. It should support the company's policies, not impose its own. Some do, some don't. It needs to be flexible to new services and needs, and it needs to contain advanced authentication measures. We've got to get beyond the password. If it's going to use something like a one-time PIN, or if it's going to use something like thumbprint scanning, as well as your password, the ideal is something that you have, something that you know, and something that you are in combination. Different kinds of firewalls. At the network level, the firewall will decide who has access to what based on where this came from and where this is trying to go to. Okay? It doesn't know who you are, it doesn't care who you are. What it cares is the network address and for the source and destination at the network level. And that's for each individual part of a message, each individual packet of information. At the application level, we're looking at hosts running proxy servers, permitting no traffic directly between networks, which perform all kinds of logging and auditing of traffic passing through them. That's a firewall at the application level. So firewalls themselves should be capable of employing filtering techniques either to permit or to deny services to specific host systems as required. And that means you need an IP filtering language to filter out as many attributes as possible. So we can block specific addresses or permit only specific addresses, block destinations or permit only destinations. Look at TCP or UDP source and destination. Address both the inbound and the outbound interface and contain the ability to centralize access via SMTP, which means that emails will be centralized within the organization. In addition to that, that's for your own legitimate users. They should be able to accommodate controlled public access to your site. The whole purpose of using the internet, as opposed to using it as an extranet, using it simply as a backbone for your own internal networks. If you're going to use the internet as such, you want people to come, but come in a controlled way. So we want to be able to filter it, particularly filter things like dial-in access. Log all traffic coming in and any suspicious activities. We want the firewall itself to require a secured version of the operating system be used. If you're running Windows, I know financial institutions that are still running Windows XP. And Windows XP is virtually impossible to secure without putting a tremendous amount of effort and cost into buying security packages. But even at that, it's very, very difficult to get it properly secured. If you're using one of the later versions of Windows, it's very, I won't say it's very easy, it's very possible to secure it. But again, you need to decide what you want secured and then set it up to be secured. as it comes out of the box, newly installed, it is not secured. It is not switched on. So your firewall needs to utilize a secure version and be simple in design and particularly simple in use. As I said, no firewall is 100% effective, but you need strong automated monitoring controls. The firewalls themselves should be a one-way mirror. It should not be possible to send information about the internal network out through the firewall. If you're going to use a public domain firewall, if you're going to download one off the internet, get it in source code and have it checked for unauthorized coding by someone who knows, because a lot of the firewalls you can download from the internet come with backdoors, with concealed code that allows someone else to come in. There was a lovely backdoor was developed by a hackers group. I'm trying to think which one it was. It wasn't the Chaos Club. It was a Cult of the Mad Cow. They have nice names, hacker groups. And they developed one called Back Orifice. And if you were concerned that you had been penetrated by Back Orifice and that someone was able to gain access to your systems, you might want to go on the internet and download some software to check for Back Orifice. And a lot of that software that checked for Back Orifice actually installed Back Orifice on your network. So be careful when you get anything off the internet that you're then going to run. Internet passwords should not be used internally. If somebody breaks in via the internet because they can get hold of your password, that's as far as they should get. No firewall file systems should be remotely mountable, which is a Unix term, because if they're remotely mountable, they're remotely dismountable. And firewalls need to be thought of as only one layer of the security onion. It is not foolproof and it's not the be-all and the end-all. Dangers of firewalls: if the firewall for any reason is compromised, what's left? Do you have anything else? If it's broken into, how easy is it to detect? Is anything else monitoring the firewall other than the firewall itself? And if something does go wrong, someone's come in through the internet in a post-mortem, how much information does the firewall keep for forensic examination later on? And one of the huge problems with firewalls, how inconvenient is it? Because if people find it inconvenient, they're going to switch it off. And that brings us to our third polling question, which is, funnily enough, on firewalls. And the third polling question says that attributes of a good firewall include always running extensive logging, denial service to other host systems, denial services from other host systems, denial of all services unless specifically permitted. Please vote now. And we're almost fully voted. So I'll close the poll and share the results. It's tempting to say always run extensive logging. There may be other logs that are being run that you don't need the firewall to duplicate. Essentially what you're wanting your firewall to do is say, unless I know what you are and what you're allowed to do, you don't get it. So deny all services unless they're specifically permitted. Okay. So I've got through your firewall. What's left? What other security mechanisms could you potentially have? I mentioned to you network address translation. Now, this is commonly part of a firewall, but it doesn't have to be within the firewall. What we've got is automatic translation of all of the internal IP addresses to a single external one, so that anyone monitoring will see that all traffic appears to originate from one single IP address, and it hides all internal addresses from access by unauthorized users. So I can't see if you're online because I can't ping you because I don't know what your address is. I can't say who is that person. Hardening of the operating system involves taking your whichever operating system you're dealing with, and it could be a mainframe, it could be a mini, it could be a micro, and eliminating from the system all the standard features that reduce the security which are not necessary in a firewall. So in other words, if the hacker gets through, he gets isolated in a controlled environment and he's unable to get into any other area, any other services, and to break all the way through the firewall. You might be able to break in, you cannot then break out into your home network. I mentioned packet level screening. All of the IP packets have to go through that firewall server, and there we can have interface specific kernel level package filters with user definable rules to further restrict access to services. So I can actually say nobody coming in other than from these specific network addresses can access these services within the computer division. And at a good firewall, you'll have a menu-driven interface for setting up the rules so that your IS security officer can set up the rules as laid down by user management. And you have to be able to configure that sensitivity and say, I want it wide open or I want it tied right down, because certain systems will be of more concern than others. And that's the problem with the change of password every 30 days. Not every user has the same access rights, and some of them are going to be of greater security threat than others. And that brings us to our fourth polling question, which is looking at operating system hardening. Operating system hardening would include isolation of a user, an intruder, in a controlled environment, total prevention of unauthorized access, inclusion of all available operating system features, ensuring all IP packets go through the firewall. And remember, this is not a perfect firewall. This is a good firewall. You notice I always wait till everyone's voted, or almost everyone's voted, before I give you a hint. I will close the poll and share the results. Okay. Operating system hardening. Okay. Ensure all packets go through the firewall. Remember, if the firewall is down, what's left? Well, if you've got a hardened operating system and you've said all IP packets have to go through the firewall and the firewall is down, you've just said we've cut everyone off. So you've done a denial of service attack on yourself. Total prevention of unauthorized access, not possible. Remember, all the firewall is doing is saying that terminal is allowed to get into that service. What it can do at that service is going to be controlled at the service level, not necessarily at the operating system level. So the best thing that the operating system can do is take an intruder, once it's been recognized, lock them in a controlled environment where you can try and find out who the hell they are and what are they trying to do. Okay, I said to you we should encrypt. For those of you who are not familiar with encryption, encryption is probably the most common form of transmission protection. Problem with it, it conceals the content of the message and it makes undetected message corruption difficult. It doesn't stop the message being corrupted, but if you corrupt it, it will not decrypt. And if it doesn't decrypt, then someone will notice that this message is being got at. Unfortunately, you'll find that encryption is illegal in some countries. In South Africa, it is illegal to encrypt information flying over the public switch network. Okay. Now, everybody does, and all of the banks do, and all of the businesses do, because it's the only way you can do it. And they've said, please take us to court. We want something on the statute book that says we can encrypt. And the government has refused to prosecute on the basis we want to keep that up our sleeve in case we pick up a terrorist, a suspected terrorist, using encrypted information. We cannot crack it, so we can't prove what they're doing, but at least we can nail them for sending encrypted information and put them in jail for that instead. Okay, so you may find it's illegal in some countries. If you're sending information to the UK, you are allowed to encrypt, but the legislation in the UK says that with a court order, the police can require you to give them the decryption key. Failure to do so will result in a custodial sentence. Go to jail, go directly to jail, etc. So it's not always as cut and dried as you'd think. Encryption, even if it works, does not prevent message destruction or loss. It does not prevent knowledge of the fact that there was a message sent. I can encrypt the content of the message. I cannot encrypt the header of the message, because to get it to fly over the internet, it has to know where it is going to, so it needs that address, and when it replies, it has to know where to send it back to, so it needs that address, so they cannot be encrypted. So someone can still monitor that you are talking to me. It does not prevent the message being inaccurate, incomplete, untimely, or simply wrong. The fact it's an encrypted message doesn't mean it's the right message. Doesn't even mean it's an authorized message. Problems with encryption: the length of the key. Having a short key is like having a combination lock with 5 combinations. Doesn't take that long to crack it. Now, a modern encryption that you would normally buy with your software these days is 128-bit or greater encryption. And 128-bit, the software that I use is a security package called Kremlin. I use it for some of my on-disk encryption. And Kremlin estimates that if 1 million computers were trying to crack 1 million keys per second, it would take approximately twice the length of the universe, or the length of the life of the universe, to crack it, to crack one key, because it uses Cypher SK168, which is a 168-bit key. So the longer the key, the more complex, the tighter the encryption. But the longer it takes to encrypt and the longer it takes to decrypt. So there's a trade-off. Length of the key. Management of the key. How many people know the key? It's like saying we've got a lock on the door. How many people have got a key for the lock? Now, encryption comes in two basic forms. You have symmetrical and you have asymmetrical. Symmetrical says one key encrypts and the same key decrypts. Okay. Asymmetrical says one key will encrypt and the different key will decrypt. You cannot encrypt and decrypt the same key. We'll take a look at how that works. Availability of the algorithm. If the algorithm is publicly available, and some of them are, they're publicly printed, then it's possible for you to write a program to try and crack that algorithm. Now, you're going to need a lot of computing power to do it, but it can be done. In the old days, back in the 70s, the data encryption standard, DES, was taken to be the best encryption that there was. Nowadays, someone with a laptop computer can probably crack DES using downloadable software off of the internet, and they'll crack a DES key in probably about an hour. Reversibility of the ciphertext. How easy is it to run it backwards through the algorithm? So, in other words, how complicated is the algorithm? And the other common problem is use of common words as encrypted passwords. I don't need to decrypt your password. I can take a dictionary and encrypt every word in it and look for a comparison between the encrypted words. When I find one that matches, there's your password. So how does it work and why do we have a key? This is a very basic encryption technique known as a Caesar shift. The reason that we use a key is because if you take any given piece of text, whether it's English, German, French, it doesn't matter, in that particular language, there'll be a letter frequency. So in the given piece of text, the letter E will occur 13.6% of the time. The letter T will occur 13.2% of the time. And there's a frequency for every single letter in an English paragraph. There's also frequencies for combinations, ST, TH, etc. Double O, in Afrikaans, double A. So what we need is we need some kind of randomizing mechanism that says the first time you come to an E, we'll make it a Z, Z, and the next time you come to an E, we'll make it a Q. And the way we do that is with a shift, with a key. So here we have a key of Fred, and there's my alphabet that I've written out. Underneath it, we've got Fred. So F, G, H, I, J, K, L, M, N, back to A, B, C, D, E. R, S, T, U, V, W. So if I want to send a message, pay the bear, I'll take my P. There's my P. It's the first letter. So I'll look it up on the first line, and it's a U. My next letter is an A, but it's the second letter, so I'll look it up on the second line, and that's an R. The next line is an E. Sorry, the next line is a Y. Next letter is a Y, and that's the third one. So I'll look my Y up on the third line, and it'll come out as a 2. The next one is a T. This is the fourth one. I'll go along. There's my T. Look it up in the fourth line, and it's going to come out as a W. Then comes an H. Now I've got a short key, so I'll go back to the start. There's my H. Look it up on the first line, and it's going to come out as an M. And so on and so forth. The longer that key is, the less combinations of letters that you're going to have. The letter E will only occur in the same encrypted version 1 in 1,000 E's, or 1 in 100,000 E's, or 1 in 20 million E's. IDEA. This is not IDEA, the interrogation package. The International Data Encryption Algorithm came out in 1991. Came out with a 64-bit block cipher, which is like DES, with a 128-bit key, which is good. It was optimized for software speed. So what happened was it took 64-bit blocks and bust them up into 4 16-bit blocks. Then it took your 128-bit key and derived 52 different subkeys, and then it used those to encrypt 8 times over, which was kind of neat. Okay. Now, you can see there, that's a slow process. I've got to split it up. I've got to derive the subkeys. I've got to encrypt it 8 times before I come up with an encrypted message. And to decrypt it, I've got to do all of that backwards. So it was optimized to run as fast as it could go. The IDEA was not the only one. There are other encryption mechanisms. There are better ones. There are worse ones. AES was the advanced encryption standard specified. It specified a FIPS-approved cryptographic algorithm, which used a 256-bit key in 14 rounds. Serpent used a 256-bit key, a 128-bit block, and it operates in XTS mode. AES Two-Fish Serpent. Can you see there's a variety of things out there? See 3 ciphers in the cascade. To each bit, 128-bit block is first encrypted with Serpent, which has got its own 256-bit key, then by Two-Fish, and finally by AES. So there's a whole variety of mechanisms that you can use to encrypt. Problem is, if I can get to Fred, I can decrypt. So it's crucial to security that that encryption key be kept confidential. And 4 main functions. We've got to create the key, define what the key will look like, generate the key, distribute it to everyone who needs to speak to us, and then initialize that key. There is another form of authentication that you'll find on the internet called Kerberos authorization. Kerberos, named after Kerberos, the dog guarding the gates to Hades. Okay. And the idea behind this is where you are trying to expose your site to the world, but you want to keep it controlled. You don't want everyone to access, but you don't necessarily know all of the users out there in every country in the world. You go and you pay a security server to do it with you, to do it for you rather. So you have an application server. When a user wants to talk to you, they will ask the security server. They will put their password in, send their user ID. The user, the security servicer, then creates what's called a ticket granting ticket, and it encrypts it using your password, and it sends that back to you. When you get it, you've got a list of things that you are now allowed to access. Oh look, there's the application server I want. So you now take that ticket granting ticket, which has been encrypted to you, so hopefully only you could see it, and you now send it back to the security server requesting a ticket for that specific application server. The security server then creates a ticket and encrypts it with the application server's password, not yours, the application server's. Sends it to you. Now to you, it's garbage. You now present it to the application server, and the application server decrypts the ticket, and if it's okay, it will allow you in. It doesn't know who you are. You don't know how to access it. Everything's being done at third hand because of that security server. And that's the way a Kerberos system works. It's used primarily for large unknown populations. And one of the first business areas that made massive use of Kerberos authentication was pornography, where the client would pay to have access into naughtybits.com. But it doesn't know how to get into naughtybits.com, so it logs into pornography.com, identifies itself. Pornography.com says, this user is allowed to look at naughtybits.com, sends it the access right, the ticket to the user presents it to naughtybits.com and gets in. And it's all transparent to the user. Kerberos authentication takes us to our fifth polling question, which, funnily enough, is on encryption. Encryption is foolproof, prevents knowledge that a message was ever existed, prevents message destruction, or is only as good as its key management. We seem to be getting a unanimous opinion. We still have a few votes to come in. I'll close it in 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Closed. Share the results. And the majority of people have gone for it is only as good as its key management. And that would be the correct answer. Okay. Now all of that to work, for our firewalls to work, for encryption to work, for our key management to work, we need the appropriate security policies. And that means that we need business policies reflecting business requirements, so that they can then be implemented through the appropriate system rules and configurations, the standards that we use, and the human rules and the management processes, in other words, the procedures that we use. And for most organizations, you're going to have multiple users communities, some in-house, some on the other end of the world, some coming in via the internet, some outsiders coming into library systems via the internet, each one with a different level of trust, different levels of access and control, with different policy authorities. So our policy architecture, we can use security domains and lock people into different domains and different subdomains. It can be physical domains, it can be logical domains, so that an outsider gets into a domain, an insider gets into a different domain. And you can segregate them through your firewalls, and you can segregate them through roles. And the roles are laid down by the owners of those domains. Generally speaking, access control is inefficient access control at security service level. We've got multiple webs, files, prints, etc., stacks of pages. Each infrastructure entity will consist of multiple objects, some of which you want them to get into, some of which you don't. And each object can then have an access control mechanism with the rights and permissions and the owners. And it's a nightmare. Massively complex user profiles, huge cost in overhead, machine overhead and management resource, and a huge cost in what the user thinks of security. So we can set up role architectures. Now the contextual role is typically your job title. The conceptual role would be your job specification, what are you allowed to do. The logical role will say these are your domains of operation. Your physical role will have the access control list roles. Components will have the logical groupings, and down to the operational role with the local rights and permissions. What are you allowed to do? If we look at each of those in turn, contextual access control says what access do you have in the context of what you're trying to do it, when you're trying to do it, where you're trying to do it from. And that can be applied centrally or it can be applied locally. And we can use that to register and certify a unique identifier with a particular role that they're allowed to carry out. Role qualifications. We can identify these users are security administrators. These are webmasters. These have security access to sensitive code. These ones don't. And we can develop application level security components for each of those. And you can split it up by business function if you so desire. Where are we going? Well, we're aiming towards things like quantum cryptography, which is used to produce and distribute the encryption key, including the ability of the two communicating users to detect the presence of any third party trying to gain knowledge of the key, which gives us an efficient authenticity and integrity for multicasts, and efficient key management for multicasts. We're looking for adequate authentication. As I say, passwords and PINs are obsolete and never really worked anyway. So we're looking at things like biometrics, authentication of you by who you are, mobile code security. So we're controlling access to our resources, domain name server security, so that people cannot get in and change things. I had a phone call from a client some years back saying, when did you go and start for this work for this particular company? I said, I don't. One of the big insurance companies. He said, that's funny. Every time I go to your website, I end up with that insurance company. So I tried it myself, and right enough, I ended up in the insurance company. I then tried the insurance company, and I ended up in my website. Now, given the fact that they were getting 1,000 times more traffic than me, the surprising thing was that nobody had phoned the insurance company to complain. And the problem was a corruption at the domain name server. Our addresses had been switched. Packet traceback techniques so that we can figure out where did this come from. PKI, public key infrastructure. Public key is a more advanced version of cryptography, where you have two keys, one to encrypt, one to decrypt. The encrypt key cannot decrypt the message, the decrypt key cannot encrypt the message, but either one can go from A to B or from B to A, which may sound a bit Irish. It's based on an insoluble mathematical problem. What two numbers multiplied together make 55, other than 1 and 55? 11 and 5. The two factors of 55 are 11 and 5. 5 into 55 gives you 11. 11 into 55 gives you 5. 5 into 55 does not give you 5. 11 into 55 does not give you 11. And those correspond to the two keys of the crypto system in public key infrastructure, where I can encrypt with 5 and you can decrypt with 11. Or you can encrypt with 11 and I can decrypt with 5. One of them will be a public key. Let's say 5 is a public key. Everyone in the world, you want to talk to me, encrypt it with 5. Only I know that it takes an 11 to decrypt. Now, if you've got a 168-bit key, what's the chances of someone figuring out? Because there's no mathematical way of doing it to figure out the factors other than take a number, divide, and see if you end up with the remainder. You know it's 5 and 11 because you learned it at school. We also need strong intrusion detection and response that will flag someone is trying to do something which they're not authorized to do or it's not possible to do. We need defense in depth. What must we do? Make IT security higher and more visible priority in higher education, because it's not just in the companies, this is in the social media. Do a better job with existing security tools, including looking at your institutional policies to make sure they fit in. Design and develop and deploy improved security for future research and education networks. Get the whole security collaboration up among higher education, industry and government. And these days we're now starting to think about primary education. Integrate higher education work on security into the broader national effort to strengthen their critical infrastructures. As far as preventative and detective controls are concerned, nothing really changed because we went onto the internet. We still look at application behavior profiling and the rules, asset classification, data security, communication security, legal and contractual requirements, security breach detection. Those are standard controls that should be working anywhere. We need to work on our human element to improve employee behavior and attitudes. If they're not going to protect their own money with their own PIN on their ATM, they're not going to protect yours bringing their own equipment to work. Make them accountable, make them aware. Give them this job-specific awareness, and if necessary, specialist training and education. As I said, social networks, we've got everything out there. The human network connecting people to people with common areas of interest. And they're linked by emails, photos, Wikipedias, blogs, you name it, including the mashup and generalized user-generated contents generated and pushed out to people and businesses by the end users. We're up in the cloud. And in the cloud, we've got various kind of cloud computing models. Enterprise 1, we've got remote users and office users linking via the internet, linking to an enterprise LAN, linking to other cloud providers. Types of clouds depends on how you've set it up and what you've bought. Software as a service, data as a service, platform as a service, infrastructure as a service, identity and policy management as a service, or simply network as a service. All of these potentially have their own risks. Risks like any other form of access, privileged user access. Who at the cloud provider will have access to your data? Regulatory compliance. Data location and ownership. Where is it going to be? Do you even know which country it's going to be in? Do you know where the backups are going to be kept? Who owns the data once it's in the cloud? Is it yours or is it the provider of the service? Data segregation, recovery. That's from a book that was published way back in, an article that came out way back in InfoWorld, looking at cloud computing security risks. There's a download site there that you can bring it down from. And that brings us to our final polling question. And our final polling question says, Security architectures may include. Please vote now. We'll close the poll and share the results. And the majority of people have gone for role architectures, which is correct. We're going to wrap up with a quote, a favourite quote of mine, from Winston Churchill at the end of the Battle of Britain. Where are we now? He said, after the Battle of Britain, now is not the end. It is not even the beginning of the end, but it is perhaps the end of the beginning. And that's where we are with the internet, perhaps at the end of the beginning. Ladies and gentlemen, any questions? Don't be shy.
Well, thank you, Richard. I don't see any questions that have come in. If you would show the screen with the next sessions that are coming up. The Advanced IT Security Reviews will be on May 26th, followed by Performance Auditing and IT Function, May 28th, and then finally closing with Managing the IT Audit Function. I want to thank you, Richard, for a great presentation today, and I want to thank everybody for joining us for this webinar, and we look forward to seeing you again next Tuesday. Thanks, and
Okay. Thanks.
bye.
Bye.